All right. I would now like to introduce Karen Putz, who is sharing about her journey of living with a hearing loss as well as raising children who also have a hearing loss. She is the mother of 3 kids, all of which have a hearing loss. And then, Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about yourself and your journey?
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure being here tonight with all of you. Just really briefly, if you're wondering, hold on just a second here. I'm sorry, I hear the interpreter signing everything I was saying. Anyhow, I wanted to introduce you to the system that I'm using right now to hear you guys on the phone. I'm using a video phone, and on the video phone is an interpreter listening in and signing everything that you all say. So that's how it works with me on the phone. I can't hear on the phone, but with the use of an interpreter, everything becomes pretty clear. So a little bit about me. I was born with normal hearing, and I started losing my hearing in elementary school. And I do remember being able to hear because when I was very young, I used to crawl into bed and listen to my father tell stories at night before I went to bed, until one day I could no longer hear him in the dark. And that's when I knew I had lost my hearing at that point. My hearing loss wasn't really officially discovered until I was 7. I didn't receive a hearing aid until I was 9. So basically, I just floated through the educational system with no support services whatsoever as I was growing up until I believe it was 7th grade or maybe even 6th. I received speech therapy. And at that time, it probably lasted maybe 2 or 3 years from what I remember. And after I went to high school, and pretty much the same thing, the first year in high school, no support services until I had my first itinerant teacher. I was really, really fortunate because that itinerant teacher introduced me to my first hard of hearing friend in high school. And we're still friends to this day. So that's why I always stress the importance of deaf and hard of hearing peers in your lives, in your children's lives. So anytime you can connect with another family, that has a great benefit not only for you as a parent, but for your child as well. So I really encourage connections with other families. Let's see, okay. As a teenager, I absolutely loved barefoot water skiing. And one day I was barefoot water skiing and I fell. I took a hard fall into the water and instantly went from hard of hearing to deaf. And this was when I was 19. But in many ways, that was a blessing because for my entire life, I pretty much did the blending in, fitting in, flying under the radar thing. I didn't want to stand out. I tried to be as normal as possible, trying to be the best imitation of a hearing person that I could be. So when I became deaf, at first it was very devastating. And I pretty much cried for a couple of weeks, which turned into months. And then one day I woke up and I thought, okay, I have 2 choices. I could either continue to grieve and continue to be miserable, or I could embrace the whole change and become the best possible deaf person I could be. So that day was a turning point in my life, and that's when I learned to embrace being deaf. And a whole new world opened up for me. I started meeting other deaf and hard of hearing people and just learning a whole new language, and I just basically dove into the deaf way of life. I always say that my world was pretty narrow before I became deaf. And then once I became deaf, the whole world opened up. because all of a sudden I met many other people who were deaf and hard of hearing. After I graduated from college, I got my first job, and I traveled a lot in that job. My husband and I were also on a volleyball team for 12 years. We traveled around the country playing volleyball. So as you can imagine, I loved to travel. Well, one by one, 3 kids came along. Today, my kids are 20 years old, 18 years old, and 16 years old. When each of them were born, they were born with normal hearing. In my family, there's a gene that goes back 5 generations. And the gene in our family is extremely rare. At the time that it was diagnosed, there were only 3 families in the world that had that gene. And we were the first United States family with that gene identified. And it's basically a bunch of numbers and letters. It's a mitochondrial gene that's passed on through females. My mom and all of her siblings are deaf and hard of hearing. My mom passed it on to me and my siblings. One by one, we all lost our hearing in different ways. My brother also lost it from barefoot water skiing. And my sisters, they lost it by blows to the head, as well as my other brother. So when my kids were born, they were born with normal hearing. David was diagnosed when he was almost 3 years old. We think, but we're not sure, that he may have lost his hearing when he was about 2. I remember a day when he threw a tantrum and he threw his head back, and he hit his head very hard that day. But we'll never know. My other 2 kids were diagnosed shortly after an illness. Lauren was 4 and Stephen was 2, and they became very sick one day for almost a week. And when they recovered, Lauren went to school and came home with a teacher's note saying that she could no longer really hear while in the classroom. You would think that I would have gone on to, get services for Stephen, but no, I was heavily into denial. I always said that denial isn't just a river in Egypt. It's a very safe mechanism for people who don't want to face the real world. That's how I describe denial. I was so overwhelmed at that point, I kind of dropped the ball in my 3rd child. But eventually, Stephen was diagnosed, and then pretty much we had 10 hearing aids in our family. And life just started humming along. And I guess this is probably a good point where I could share what I call the macaroni and cheese story with all of you. And I work in early intervention as a deaf mentor. So I visit families, birth to 3. One day I visited this family with a 2.5-year-old boy. And the mom greeted me at the door one day. And she said to me, "Karen, I don't get it. My son was asking for macaroni and cheese the other day, and he threw a tantrum when I took the box out of the cabinet. He didn't understand that I had to cook the macaroni and cheese." So I said, "Okay, let's break this down. Think about it. When you have hearing kids and you say, do you want some macaroni and cheese?" The kids who can hear you walk into the kitchen, open the cabinet, get out the box, and they hear the rattle of the noodles inside of it. They hear you walk over to the sink, fill up a pot. They hear you clang the pot on the stove and rip open the top of the box and pour the dry noodles into the boiling water. The whole time the kids are still playing on the floor, but they're getting in all this auditory information. And it seems so insignificant at the time, but when you think about it, it's the building blocks of language. The kids, while they're playing, are processing this whole thing that they need to know on how to make macaroni and cheese. With the deaf kid, the macaroni and cheese just magically appears. They're missing out on all that information that kids with normal hearing are getting and processing. And this is why when I work with parents, I remind them to do activities that fill in the auditory building block. Think about it. Like when Daddy comes home from work, the kid's playing on the floor, and all of a sudden Dad appears. Kids with normal hearing, they hear their dad drive up in the driveway, the garage door is opening, and they hear Dad's footsteps coming into the house. Deaf and hard of hearing kids are likely to miss that information. So when we think about it, we have to fill in all that auditory information that you hear throughout the day. Even when it seems really insignificant, it's very significant for deaf and hard of hearing kids because they can't fill that information in on their own. So I always encourage families to do activities around that auditory information. Fill it in, whatever you hear throughout the day. Another important thing is, like, for example, phone calls. And when you think about it, the deaf kid only misses, maybe gets half of the conversation, has no idea what mom is saying to whoever it is on the other end of the phone. And think about this. Let's say mom and dad get into an argument in the morning, and the deaf and hard of hearing kid sitting there watching mom and dad have an argument. And then dad goes off to work. Maybe the deaf kid misses the phone call where dad calls mom and they make up. Hearing kids get to hear that information. They hear the conversation. They hear mom saying, "I love you," back to dad. And all of a sudden they know that the argument is over. The deaf kid may still be thinking about the argument all day long and not knowing that mom and dad made up. So this is why it's important to share that kind of information and fill in the blank for deaf and hard of hearing kids. Now, speaking of travel, I do travel quite a bit, and that's what the topic of this is tonight. Today, I work as I work from home, for one thing. I work for myself. I work part-time for Handed Voices as the Director of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Infusion. I also got back on the water 4 years ago as a competitive barefoot water skier. So I travel a lot around the country, and I speak. I'm a writer. So I'm frequently on the plane. So one of the things I wanted to share with all of you is some travel tips with your kids. How to make it easier with travel and what I go through, with travel. We can start off by talking about airplanes. And I will tell you this tip. Fly Southwest. It sounds like an ad here. But seriously, with Southwest, one of the biggest advantages with Southwest is that I can pre-board. And it makes it much easier for me to sit up in the front of the plane where the flight attendants can get to me quickly if they need to share any information, flight changes, or if the flight's redirected, or if turbulence is coming up, that kind of thing. So it's really helpful for me, especially when I'm flying Southwest, to sit up front where the flight attendants can get to me really quickly. Now, I've been known to miss a plane. This has only happened once, and that's because the gate changes happen. Most flights, you can get a text when a flight changes, and that's great. Southwest is great about that. But when I have an agency that books a flight for me, or an airline that does not do text alerts, I have to be on hyper alert with gate changes. This is especially helpful if you have teenagers who are traveling, You need to teach them how to be alert to any changes that happen, and use the text messaging services whenever you can. Now here's a tip for traveling in the car with your kid. I've heard some families using FM systems in the car, and I think that's absolutely great. Other families use one-hand signing, to communicate with their kids in the back seat. Still others install a really big rear-view mirror just under the rear-view mirror, and the child can see mom and dad talking or even signing into the mirror. And when you think about it, the car is like the absolute perfect place to practice language. You may not think so, but like for me, when my kids were little and we would take trips, that was the time that we practiced the listening skills with music. I would put familiar songs on, songs that they knew from videos. Like, for example, when we had signing time videos, it also came with a CD of just the songs alone. And they learned to listen and follow along to songs that they knew through the videos. Then when we were in the car, they would transfer that ability to practice with that. And if you have a child who, very much deaf, uses ASL, you can still introduce music to them in a very visual way. So definitely think beyond the limits with your kid. Well, I'm going to stop here and pause right here and open this up for questions if anybody has any before we continue. So go ahead and unmute if anyone has questions. Does anyone have any questions before you go on? Are we still connected?
Karen, it's Carrie. Yes, we're still connected.
Oh, okay. Wanted to make sure that it was quite quiet here. We have a quiet group tonight, don't we?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, going back to my children, as I said, they're 20, 18, and 16 now, and the three of them have done quite a bit of traveling themselves. And I would tell you, as a parent, one of the hardest things to do is to let go of your kids. To actually let them travel on their own, that can be a really scary thing. My daughter, she's been traveling since she was 12. She used to go to Texas once a year by herself to spend some time with one of her best friends who had moved. And one of the stories I share about letting go, and I think it's one of the hardest things to do as a parent, is to let go of our kids and let them do things on their own and let them fail. As hard as it is as a parent, it's probably one of the best things you can do is to let go of your kids and let them fail. I wanted to share a story with my son, my oldest son, David. When he was 16, he came home one day, and he said to me, Mom, I really want to go on a camping trip with some of my friends. And at 16 years old, they're starting to get more and more independent at that point. And like I said, as a parent, it's hard to let go. Well, my husband and I, we sat down one night and we went over the pros, over the cons. Should we let our son go on this camping trip with the family that we didn't know? Well, we talked to the family, And we finally made the decision that we would let our son go on this camping trip with the family. And they were going on a lake with a boat. So I was really, really nervous about letting go. About 2 days later, all of a sudden, I was on Facebook surfing, and a picture pops up. It was a picture of my son, his friend, and another friend jumping off a 30-foot bridge into the lake. And this was posted on Facebook. I nearly had a heart attack. As a parent, you start thinking of all the awful things. Oh my gosh, what if he had crashed into something? And my gosh, how could these irresponsible parents allow this to happen? And what was I thinking letting my son go on this camping trip? Well, when my son arrived home from the camping trip, he had the biggest smile on his face. He was like, "Mom, that was the best weekend I've ever had." Well, I lit into him about jumping off a 30-foot bridge into lake water. It's like, what were you thinking? So he said to me, "Mom, their family has been going there for years and years, and every year they jump off that bridge." So I was like, oh, okay. There's a little bit more reassuring that they weren't irresponsible parents. But I learned a lesson from it. Was that as hard as it was to let go of my son and let him to travel on his own and to experience a weekend away from home, it was really, really hard for me to do that. But as a result, my son came home with some of the best memories of his life. So as hard as it is as a parent, sometimes letting go gives our children the most growth. And it's just something to think about. When your child comes up to you and wants to try something new, you have to weigh those pros and cons. And you have to ask yourself, are you holding back because of your own fears? Is it time to let your kids go out there and experience something of life? And the other thing is parents sometimes we're really quick to step in and save our kids from experiences. And when we do that, we actually rob them of the opportunity to learn on their own. We rob them of the ability to experience something and to grow from it. So as a parent, sometimes we have to step back and ask ourselves if we're standing in the way of our kids' growth. And sometimes our fears of raising deaf and hard of hearing kids, sometimes we think the world out there is so cruel and mean that sometimes we shelter our kids from it. And sometimes the very best thing for our kids is to let them go out there and fail and learn from their failures. Let's see, more on Twitter. Let me look here. Yes. If you go to hearinglikeme.com, I've written an article on traveling with hearing loss. We will post that link on the Illinois Hands and Voices website after this. But that article covers pretty much everything from airplanes, trains, buses, cars, staying in a hotel, how to get access in the hotel, and it covers all of that. One little tip is the interpreter's telling me you heard something.
Yes, Karen, the line beeps when somebody joins the call or leaves the call, and it was a beep for one of those reasons.
Oh, okay. Okay. One last little tip when you're traveling is definitely to call ahead for any accessibility needs for your kids. Like, for example, going to Disney. Disney is pretty good now about accessibility with closed captioning for most of their events. They'll provide interpreters. everywhere you go when you travel, you probably have to call ahead and plan ahead. And if your child uses interpreters, one of the tips that I use when I travel is I call local community colleges or interpreter programs, and I see if they have interpreters who need hours. And that's how I usually fulfill some of my travel needs with interpreters, by hooking up with local community colleges that have interpreter programs. And I'm usually able to find interpreters for events that are not covered by the ADA. Okay, let's open it up if any of you have any travel questions or even questions about raising kids who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Hi, Karen. This is Mindy. When you go through security at the airport, do you leave your hearing aids on?
That's a good question, Mindy. I always leave it on. Even with cochlear implants nowadays, it doesn't even set off the scanner in most cases. Most people that I know go right through the scanner with their equipment on. Sometimes they'll inform a TSA official.
Good to know. Thank you.
This is Carrie. Off of that question, do you experience any feedback or anything through your hearing aid when you go through that security check or the systems?
No, I don't. No. This is Karen. I don't know if we have any other deaf and hard of hearing on the line. This is Karen speaking again. But no, I don't usually, there's no feedback. The only time I usually experience feedback is if I'm wearing a hat. Anyone else?
I have one. This is Tommy. I now have a 16-year-old, and I'm wondering, you're on your third driver-to-be. Any hints on teaching them to drive?
That's a good one. Yeah, the first two have their driver's license. The third one is about to enter the permit stage and get a driver's license. For us, the biggest tip that I can give is to go to someplace really, really remote and let your kids start there. An empty parking lot in the school on a weekend, those are probably great places to practice, where there's no stress, no pressure, and no danger of hitting anything. 'Cause that's the hardest thing. And, make sure you communicate to your child before they take over on the wheel. Because it's really nerve-wracking to talk with them as they're driving.
Yes.
Hang on 1 second here. We're switching interpreters. Okay, we're good. We can go ahead.
Karen,
Does anyone else have any questions?
Karen, this is Carrie. Speaking of driving, what do you find, I think, the most difficult thing maybe because of your hearing loss driving, if there is anything?
I think the most difficult thing, number one, for us is if you don't get driver's ed in the school, it's really, really challenging to get access in private driver ed classes. That's our challenge lately, is trying to get them to provide interpreters for their classes. A challenging thing when a kid starts driving is that they're very, very stressed out and nervous, so communication becomes a little bit of a hurdle during those moments. It gets much, much better once the kid gets really comfortable with driving, and then you can have conversations with them as they drive. But in the beginning, when they're learning, I find it's best to keep quiet as much as possible and only communicate unless the kid's about ready to hit something. But if not, then keep quiet as much as possible and let the kid concentrate while they're driving.
Karen, this is Melissa.
And okay, go ahead, Melissa.
My question is, do you have any helpful hints or ideas for how a child can hear music, say, through headphones from a computer or like an iPod?
Yes, I would definitely get, if your child has an implant or hearing aids, one option is Bluetooth if it's built in, and the other option is to use an ICOM from phone app and plug that in. That's one of the things my kids used to use. Now they use earbuds that are, I'm not sure what they're called, but they can really blast music, so they can actually take their hearing aids off and use the earbuds. But for other kids, they like the ICOM. Anyone else? Well, let me throw this out. What is your most challenging issue with your kids right now?
This is Carrie. I'll start, and I'll say social stuff. They don't.
Yeah, that's always a challenge.
Yeah, they don't pick up on some of the social stuff because they're not overhearing maybe parts of the conversation. And so what they might be doing might be inappropriate or past the time of, of it happening.
Say that again.
So what they might be doing is either inappropriate, they don't realize that maybe it's immature, I guess might be the right word to use. And then, or that time might have passed and the conversation or direction of the event has changed and they're not at that, they haven't caught up to that point of it yet.
I would say even for myself, I miss so many little subtle things about conversations that go on around me. I almost don't have access to what do people talk about. I really don't know. In a social conversation, if you go to a party, what do people talk about? So that's one of the things we have to fill in with our kids. And especially like social idioms, we miss out on so much of that. Maybe jokes that happen between two people, common idioms that are used that goes way over our head because we don't have access to them. We don't have, the ability to use them the way other hearing people do. No, and this was really apparent to me when I was writing a book with another guy in Florida, and he started teaching me some of the stuff that I was missing out. And I consider myself a pretty well-educated person, but there were a lot of idioms that I didn't have access to. So anytime you have a conversation, introduce that stuff to your kids so they're in the know about social norms.
This is Melissa. I think that my biggest problem is my 7-year-old wears hearing aids, and she's been diagnosed since she was 7 to 9 months old, and she is very loud. And no matter how many times we ask her to lower her voice, she constantly yells, no matter where she's at.
That is a common problem. I mean, for one thing, I can't hear myself very well. I don't know, sometimes when I'm being loud, and even my own husband would be like, really, Karen, you're being loud right now. And I'm not aware of it. So that is a really tough, frustrating thing to do because I have no way of regulating when I'm being too loud. It's just simply physically impossible for me to know that. And that may be what your child is experiencing, that impossibility of knowing when they're being loud. One of the things you could do instead of, letting them know that they're being loud, maybe create some kind of code between all of you, so that your child, when they see that code, it's just sort of like a silent way to let them know, okay, bring the voice down a couple of notches.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Okay, I guess we can wrap up here. Thank you guys so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Karen, so much for sharing. And if you'd ever want to get in touch with Karen, you can email her or you can reach out to her through our Facebook page or website, and she'd be happy to connect with you. And Karen, I'm a little embarrassed in our updates. I forgot to include one event. Both my child and Karen's children will be participating in a performance that the Illinois Center on Deafness and the Arts, ICODA is their acronym, will be having. It's in Northbrook, and it's going to be December 6th through 8th, that weekend, so the first weekend of December, or the third weekend of December, the 20th through the 22nd, and they are performing The Wizard of Oz. And the performance is signed as well as spoken English, and tickets range from $8 to $12 depending on if it's a child, a senior, or adult. So if you're interested, you can call or text 847-334-1186, or you can email them at boxoffice@icodaarts.org. And children, I believe 4 and up are participating in this performance, and then some adults as well. So it's a great opportunity to get out with the family and do something different. So, well, thank you again, Karen, for being on the call, and for everyone else joining us on this Monday night. Everyone have a wonderful holiday week.
Really quickly, if any of you want to reach me,